models today. Thank you for joining. And we are faced with obviously a lot of change, especially even now in this environment. Every company is going to be instituting small to large scale change programs to deal with the pandemic that we found ourselves in, right? Once the economy gets going, or even while this is happening, most companies were not ready, right? So this is very pertinent to what we have been talking about all semester so far, right? And you've got, in this particular case, this is very apropos, a shift in the external environment, right? We have a huge shift right now in the external environment. So a change in the environment causes executives, causes shareholders, causes everybody to pressure or put energy towards the company to change, to adapt, so that they can meet their obligations to customers, they can meet their commitments to their shareholders, etc. So Drucker's theory, very simply, in 1994, he said that, Peter Drucker said that businesses get in trouble when they make assumptions about what the environment is going to be like. So obviously a pandemic type of situation, no one really planned for it, right? It's one of those act of God type issues that we talked about last time. So everybody has to rethink the mission, the purpose, and why a company exists, right? You've heard lots of stories about Ford, GM, Tesla, many companies, Nike, going into making medical supplies now to serve the public, right? That is short of certain types of things. So not that they're going to go into the health devices business, but they are stepping up to the challenge. Back in the 30s and 40s, or even earlier, Kaiser Permanente was a healthcare provider that actually started not as a healthcare provider, but as a different company. They morphed into healthcare because the health situation and the crisis at that time necessitated making certain things to help the healthcare workers, very much like it is now. So this happens. And then they, of course, redefined their mission around healthcare. And of course, they continued on to being a very large, profitable healthcare insurance organization, right? Assumptions have to be revalidated every now and then, right? For a valid theory, we need to make sure that the theory of business is known. Why are we in business? That should be known by all organizational members, right? And also tested. Every now and then, companies need to test whether their mode of operation or the purpose of being still is valid. If I can ask people to put their phone on mute, if they're not speaking, it would help. Thank you. We talked about the paradox of success. This is something that Locke came up with, Locke and Smith, and of course, Audia. And this is about the fact that, success actually breeds behavior that is anti-success, right? So that's the paradox part. The more successful a organization has been historically, the more it persists to be that way after radical environment change. And so with that persistence and that sort of stubbornness of being, we sometimes start to see, or they might experience, performance declines, right? So that's the paradox. If you're too successful, you get attached to how you got there, and those assumptions might be different going forward. So we certainly have discussed that. Van Den Van Poel in '95 discussed 4 theories that help us understand, and they're very process oriented. So this is theory behind how change and change processes come to be. There's a life cycle theory, there's a teleological theory, dialectical theory, and evolutionary theory. So if we look at each of these, table 8.1 really organizes this pretty well for us. If we're looking for if we're looking to, for example, compete and just be competitive and try to survive, typically we fall into an evolutionary mode, right? Where we variate based on needs, how things are going. Okay, let's change this now that we need to put in a new compensation system. Everybody's unhappy about their compensation. Suddenly we have to look at a compensation model that's different, et cetera, right? So this is about survival, right? This is about, okay, if we don't change the competitive model, perhaps we're going to lose a bunch of important people in the organization, right? Dialectic is opposition conflict based, right? So if we have conflict and conflict arises change, people want to do things differently. There's discontinuous operation, very haphazard, right? Very difficult to manage change that way. Purposeful cooperation is teleological, right? In its definition. And that means that we have specific goals that are set together as an organization, and we then implement and adapt and try to get to the end goal in a reasonable way without a lot of too much, churn in the organization. And finally, organic growth is very sort of cemented, right? We build on one, build on the other, and there's no turning back, right? So you can start to see that the two on the left side are the most progressive. The two on the right side are more sort of reactive or, default, if you want to call it. So formula for change is C plus A, B, D greater than X. What the heck is that? John, I thought we were not going to have, Professor Jack Gian, I thought we're not going to have math in this class. Well, this isn't math. This is just a framework, okay? When we talk about change, what this is basically saying is, look, the change has to be, if you take the pain that's caused by people not being satisfied with the status quo or company not succeeding at the status quo, you talk about what it takes to identify a clear desired state, and then you talk about the steps that's required, right, to reach that desired state. If you say what the change is and you add the pain of A, B, and D, right, the desired states, the level of dissatisfaction, and what it takes to get to the desired state, that has to be greater than the cost of implementing the change. Okay? Otherwise, the change won't work. If aren't enough people unhappy with it, there isn't we cannot go. It's also the pain is, the effort is not enough to justify the cost of change. So this formula is a great sort of framework to figure out whether the change moves ahead or not in an organization. Okay. Okay. So Lewin talks about 3 steps in his framework, right? Unfreezing, moving, and refreezing, right? If we look at steps to stages, they don't overlap, right? They are not discrete. That's what Schein's contribution was to Levin's theory. So step 1 is developing a need for a change. So unfreezing, right? Unfreezing, developing a need for the change. So accepting that we don't need to do status quo. That's development of a need, right? Establishing a change relationship between the agent of change and the client organization. Who is going to initiate the change and how is the change going to come about, right? In an organization. That's step 2. Step 3, we will move towards control state A to control state B, right? And then we refreeze and stabilize on that organization, right? So terminating the change agent and organization relationships are when the change is done, we no longer need the change agent. We no longer need dedicated resources to actually get the change instituted. So that's what we mean by terminating those steps. Bridges transition model, 1980, he came up with this, is intended for individual change. So this is going to relate to us more so as individuals, but it can be applied to an organization, right? Letting things go, not being stuck on the way we used to do things, right? Or we are accustomed to doing things. It's step one. Then accepting and being in sort of a limbo, neither past nor new, right? Understanding what my options are. Starting a new beginning, start to focus on new goals, priorities, try to institute new behaviors that match the goals. Trying to actually get your head wrapped around what I call this stage is wrapping my head around it psychologically, right? Maslow and Herzberg focused on the individual, the needs. What are everybody's needs? Vroom and Lawyer focused on cognitive expectations. Hackman and Uldman focused on, well, people are going to change if you have roles and assignments to them that are satisfying. So they have to have job satisfaction, right? And Skinner talks about positive reinforcements, praising people, rewarding people, recognizing people, right? That helps manage change and implement change. So again, all of these authors, these great researchers came at it and suggested different ways to implement change. In reality, it's a hybrid, right? We use elements of all of these in some way to institute a change successfully in a large-scale change program in a corporation. So here's on 8.2, table 8.2, it summarizes each of these theorists and when and what the emphasis was and the process and the application. So for example, Maslow focused on career development and job enrichment to satisfy the individual motivation and job satisfaction. Whereas Vroom focused on performance measurement and reward systems, right? And Hackman focused on work and job and roles, redefining those roles, making people feel clear about how they do their job, etc. And Skinner about reward and recognition, right? Like we mentioned. So this is a nice little summary in table 8.2 that you can refer to. I might ask you a question on an exam about, okay, using Maslow's theory, how would you implement this change? And you can give me some suggestions based on career development and job enrichment. And I might ask you, well, how would you implement Hackman's theory, right? And then you can talk about role and job redesigning, right? So I want you to be able to not necessarily memorize this, but you should be able to pull on these different frameworks when asked, right? And that's a great way to retain some of these learnings. So there are macro level strategies. Rajagopalan and Spritzer back in '97 discussed, two schools of thought, one focusing on the what and the other focusing on the how. So do we focus on content or do we focus on process? Okay, so there's pros and cons, right? If we keep these two separate, my argument would be that you would have a gap in strategic change framework, right, for a company. Every organization has to focus on both content and process. We sort of know that, right? So these guys divided this thing up into two, probably a little prematurely, right? The right answer is a merge. Chin's theory around planned strategic change talks about rationality of change, right? people tend to be rational, logical, and they follow self-interest, right? So this is classic theory, right? We know that. People, if it makes sense to you and it's good for you, you're going to go do it. Normative and reducative is conforming to norms. Okay, what should we be doing? What is everybody else doing, right? Monkey see monkey, you know, what's my neighbors doing? What's my competitor doing, right? So normative behavior starts to look at external factors, right? Power coercive is use of influence over those with less power, meaning people are forcing you to do it. If you don't do something, you don't comply, you might lose your job. So there are 3 strategies according to these guys, and I think this makes sense to me, right? This should make sense to everybody. This is, you know, you either, when you have to do something, it's either somebody's penalizing you, which is the bottom one, or it's the right thing to do, right? You're in school, you have to study. It's the right thing to do, and you know, that's normal. And empirical irrational is, well, is more thought driven and individual driven, right? Rather than environment driven. So that's a bit about these organizational change models. I want to stop here for a second and see if there are any questions before moving on to the next unit of discussion.